My name is James Miller, and what I'm about to tell you happened in the Superior National Forest back in 1957. I was 45 then, working as a forest ranger and trying my best to keep busy after losing my wife Marie to cancer the year before. Most days, I could almost convince myself I was doing okay. The work helped, checking trails, tracking animal movements, and making sure campers followed the rules. It kept my mind off the empty house I'd go home to every night. I guess I should tell you a bit about myself. I served in Korea from 1950 to 1953, came home with a Bronze Star, and this nasty scar on my left cheek from a piece of shrapnel. The war taught me a lot about survival and keeping calm when things get bad. I never thought I'd need those skills again, especially not in the quiet forests of Minnesota. But sometimes the things that happen close to home turn out scarier than anything you see in war. It all started on a frosty November morning, the kind of morning where your breath makes thick white clouds in front of your face, and the trees crack from the cold. Something felt off right from the start. Usually the forest would be full of sounds, birds calling, squirrels rushing around, gathering their last bits before winter, that sort of thing. But that morning, there was nothing. Just dead silence. The kind that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. I remember checking my watch. 6:45 a.m. The sun was just starting to peek through the trees, making the frost sparkle like tiny diamonds on the ground. That's when I found the first deer. Or what was left of it, anyway. In all my years as a ranger, I'd never seen anything like it. The poor thing had been torn apart, but not like how a normal predator would do it. The cuts were too clean, almost like someone used a knife. Steam was still rising from the body, so whatever did this couldn't be far away. I knelt down to take a closer look, and that's when I saw the tracks. My heart started beating faster as I shined my flashlight on them. These weren't regular wolf tracks. They were huge, about 18 inches long. 5 toes, almost human-like, but not quite. From how deep they sank into the frozen ground, I figured whatever made them had to weigh at least 400 pounds. Looking at those tracks, I felt something I hadn't felt since Korea. Real fear. The kind that tells you something is very, very wrong. I reached for my radio to call it in, but all I got was static. Not the normal kind of static either, but a weird pattern that almost sounded like breathing. That was just the beginning of what would turn out to be the 3 most terrifying days of my life. I started following those strange tracks, my old army instincts kicking in. The forest felt wrong, like when you walk into your house and know someone's been there even though nothing's moved. My radio kept making that weird breathing sound, getting louder whenever I walked in certain directions. Something else was odd too. I kept seeing animals running, not just 1 or 2, but whole groups. Deer, rabbits, even a few bears, all heading the same way, away from the deeper parts of the forest. In 20 years of working these woods, I'd never seen anything like it. I decided to head back to my cabin to grab more equipment. That's when things got really strange. I knew these woods like the back of my hand, but suddenly nothing looked familiar. I'd walked down a path I'd taken 1,000 times, only to end up right back where I started. It was like the forest itself was playing tricks on me. Then I saw it, or at least, I thought I did. Standing between 2 trees about 50 yards away was something. It looked like a wolf, but wolves don't stand 8 feet tall on their back legs. Its fur was dark, almost black, and its eyes. I'll never forget those eyes. They glowed like amber streetlights, but with a kind of intelligence that made my blood run cold. I blinked, and suddenly there were 3 of them. Same creature, same eyes, all looking right at me. I grabbed a stick from the ground and threw it at the nearest one. The stick went right through it, like it wasn't even there. The other 2 disappeared when I looked directly at them. Only the middle one cast a shadow in the morning light, and that's when I realized the others were just tricks, illusions. My hands were shaking as I checked my compass. The needle was spinning like crazy, completely useless. The temperature was dropping fast, way too fast for a normal November morning. I could feel my training fighting with my fear. Part of me wanted to run, but I knew better. Running from a predator is the worst thing you can do. I started walking backward, slowly, keeping my eyes on where I'd seen the real creature. The wind picked up, carrying with it a smell like old meat and wet dog. Somewhere in the distance, I heard a howl that didn't sound like any wolf I'd ever heard. It was deeper, almost like it had words in it. That's when my flashlight started flickering, and I knew I had to get back to my cabin. Fast. But with the paths all messed up and my compass not working, I wasn't sure I could find my way. The sun was getting covered by dark clouds, and the temperature kept dropping. A storm was coming, a bad one. I had a choice to make. Try to find my way back to the cabin, or stay out here with whatever this thing was. Either way, I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't going to be a normal day in the forest. Not by a long shot. I finally made it back to my cabin, but something told me I wasn't safe, not by a long shot. The wind was picking up, and dark clouds were rolling in faster than any storm I'd ever seen. I knew I had to prepare. My time in Korea taught me that surviving means thinking ahead. First thing I did was check all my doors and windows. Then I grabbed my emergency supplies, flashlights, batteries, matches, and food that didn't need cooking. I could hear something moving outside, circling the cabin. Heavy footsteps in the snow, but they weren't steady. Sometimes they'd be on one side of the cabin, then suddenly on the other, like whatever it was could move faster than any normal animal. The temperature kept dropping like crazy. My thermometer showed 32.4°F, and it wasn't even noon yet. Snow started falling so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet past my windows. The wind howled like it was alive, shaking the whole cabin. But mixed in with the wind was something else, that deep, almost human howl I'd heard before. I tried the phone, dead. The radio, nothing but that weird breathing static. Even my battery-powered equipment started acting funny, like something was draining their power. I checked my watch, 3:45 p.m., but it looked like midnight outside, because of the storm. Then the testing began. First, it was just scratches at the walls, like it was checking how strong they were. Then harder hits, making the whole cabin shake. I could hear it moving around up on the roof, then back down to the walls, like it was looking for a weak spot. The scary part was how smart it seemed. This wasn't just an animal acting on instinct. This thing was thinking. I sat in the dark with my rifle across my knees, watching the windows ice over. The scratching would stop sometimes, and those were the worst moments, the waiting, not knowing where it would try next. Every now and then, I'd see those glowing eyes peering in through a window, and sometimes there'd be 2 or 3 pairs of eyes, but I remembered only one was real. The others were just tricks to confuse me. Around 8:45, the power went out completely. I lit some candles, but the shadows they made just made things worse. Because in those shadows, I kept seeing things move, tall, dark shapes that shouldn't be there. And all the while, that howling kept getting closer and closer. I knew I was in for a long night. Part of me wished I was back in Korea, at least there. I knew what I was fighting. But this was something else entirely. And somehow I knew that this creature wasn't just trying to get in, it was playing with me, trying to wear me down. The worst part was knowing that sooner or later it would stop playing. Around midnight, everything changed. The creature stopped testing the walls and went quiet, too quiet. The only sound was the howling wind and the creaking of my cabin's wooden walls. I knew from my time in the war that when an enemy goes quiet, that's usually when they're planning something big. I was tired, cold, and scared, but I forced myself to stay alert. My rifle was loaded, though deep down I wasn't sure regular bullets would even hurt this thing. The candles were burning low, casting weird shadows everywhere. Every few minutes I'd see those glowing eyes peeking through different windows, watching me. Then I heard it, a loud crash from my bedroom at the back of the cabin. The thing had finally broken through. I could hear its claws clicking on the wooden floor, its breathing heavy and ragged. The smell hit me next, like wet dog and something rotting. My hands were shaking as I pointed my rifle toward the bedroom door. The door burst open, and there it stood. 8 feet tall, dark fur, those glowing eyes. But now I could see it clearly for the first time. It looked like a wolf, but wrong somehow. Its front legs were too long, almost like arms, with hands that had long claws instead of paws. Its face was the worst part, somewhere between a wolf and something human. I fired my rifle, but the creature moved faster than anything that big should be able to move. It knocked the gun from my hands and sent me flying across the room. I crashed into my kitchen table, breaking it to pieces. As I tried to get up, I grabbed the first thing I could find, an old silver letter opener Marie had given me years ago. The creature lunged at me, its jaws wide open, showing teeth as long as my fingers. I rolled to the side, but I wasn't fast enough. I felt a burning pain as its claws caught my left arm, just below the elbow, but at the same time, I managed to stab it with the silver letter opener. The reaction was instant. The creature let out a scream that wasn't animal or human. It was something in between. Where the silver touched it, its fur seemed to burn away. It jumped back, crashing through my front window into the snow outside. I was bleeding badly from my arm, but I knew I couldn't stop. I grabbed a letter opener and followed it outside. The blizzard was still raging, but I could see a trail of glowing blue blood in the snow. The creature was hurt, and now I knew its weakness: silver. What happened next would change my life forever. I followed those glowing blue drops in the snow, holding my bleeding arm tight against my chest. The cold was so bad it actually helped numb the pain. The creature's tracks led me deeper into the forest, where the trees grew so thick that the snow barely reached the ground. Suddenly, I heard that awful howl again, but this time, it sounded like it was in pain. The sound came from a small cave ahead. I knew going in there was probably the dumbest thing I could do, but I also knew I might never get another chance to end this. I gripped the silver letter opener tighter and stepped into the cave. The smell hit me first, like 100 dead animals all rotted together. As my eyes adjusted to the dark, I saw bones everywhere. Not just deer and elk bones, but others too. Some of them looked human. The creature was there, crouched in the back of the cave. Where I'd stabbed it with the silver, its fur had burned away. Showing gray skin underneath that looked almost like metal. Those amber eyes watched me, but now they showed something new: fear. It lunged at me one last time, but it was slower now, hurt. I dove to the side, and as it passed me, I drove the silver letter opener deep into its chest. The creature's scream shook the whole cave. Its body started smoking wherever the silver touched it, and those eyes, those terrible glowing eyes, started to dim. Then something happened that still gives me nightmares. As the creature died, it started to change. Its body seemed to fold in on itself, getting smaller and smaller, until there was nothing left but a pile of gray dust and that letter opener. I stumbled back to my cabin just as the sun was rising. The blizzard had stopped, and it looked like any other winter morning, except my cabin was half destroyed. I was missing most of my left arm, and I had a story nobody would ever believe. The Forest Service found me passed out in my cabin. When they searched the area, they found more caves, all full of bones. They found journals, too, going back decades, about missing people and weird animal attacks. But they never found any sign of the creature itself, just that pile of dust in the cave, which blew away in the wind before I could show it to anyone. They patched up my arm, but I never worked as a ranger again. How could I, knowing what was out there? These days, I live in town, and I never go into the forest at night. But sometimes, on cold winter nights when the wind is howling, I swear I can hear something out there. Something that sounds almost like words in that howl. And every time I hear it, I check to make sure my doors are locked, and I keep my silver letter opener close by. Because I know the truth, that wasn't the only one of its kind. There are more out there, hiding in the dark parts of the forest, waiting. And sometimes on the darkest nights, those glowing eyes still watch me through my windows. You might not believe my story, and that's okay. I wouldn't believe it either if I hadn't lived it. But next time you're in the forest and everything goes quiet, too quiet, just remember, sometimes the legends we tell around campfires aren't just stories. Sometimes they're warnings. My name is Robert Thompson, but everyone around here just calls me Bob. I've been a ranger at Coconino National Forest for nearly 15 years now, though sometimes I still catch myself reaching for a rodeo rope instead of my radio. Funny how old habits stick with you like that. I come from a family of forest rangers. My daddy was one, and his daddy before him. Maybe that's why the forest feels more like home to me than any house ever could. Even with my bow-legged walk courtesy of too many years riding broncos, I can still outpace most folks on these trails. But what I'm about to tell you, well, it's about something that happened during the blood moon eclipse of '68. Something that changed everything I thought I knew about these woods and the creatures that call them home. It all started when we got word about the upcoming eclipse. The Forest Service was buzzing with preparation. We were expecting hundreds of tourists to flood in for the viewing. Marcus, my partner of 3 years, was especially excited. He'd always been into that science stuff, marking his calendar months in advance and talking nonstop about how this eclipse would be spectacular. I noticed the first signs that something was off about a week before the eclipse. The animals were acting strange, real strange. Now, I've spent enough time in these woods to know when something isn't right. The deer were moving in odd patterns, gathering in places they normally avoided. The birds, especially the ravens, were collecting in numbers I'd never seen before. But it was the coyotes that really got my attention. Usually they keep to themselves, hunting in small family groups. But that week, I started seeing them move together in large packs, working together in ways that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I remember bringing it up to Marcus during our evening patrol. "Something ain't right with the wildlife," I told him. He just laughed it off, said it was probably the approaching eclipse affecting their behavior. But there was something different about his laugh that evening, something that didn't quite sound like the Marcus I knew. Looking back now, I should have paid more attention to the way his hands trembled as he marked our patrol route on the map, or how his eyes seemed to reflect the fading sunlight, just a little too brightly. But you know what they say about hindsight, it's always clearer than a desert sky at noon. As the sun began to set that evening, we heard the first howls. Not your regular coyote calls. These were deeper, more purposeful, almost like they were speaking to each other. And the way Marcus's head snapped toward the sound, well, that was the moment I first felt that cold knot of fear in my gut, the one that told me we were about to face something bigger than anything my years of ranger training had prepared me for. Little did I know, that sunset was just the beginning of the longest night of my life, a night that would test not just my courage, but also my understanding of the natural world, and my loyalty to a friend who was slowly becoming something else entirely. That night, I couldn't sleep. The howling kept getting louder, and my phone wouldn't stop ringing with calls from worried locals. They all had the same story: animals acting weird, pets going missing, livestock getting spooked for no reason. Around midnight, I decided to check on Marcus. He hadn't answered any of my radio calls since our evening patrol. When I pulled up to his cabin, something felt off. All the lights were on, but the curtains were drawn. His truck was there, but his dog, Rex, who usually barked at everything that moved, was dead quiet. "Marcus?" I called out, climbing his porch steps. My flashlight beam caught something odd, claw marks on his doorframe, fresh ones. Not from a bear, too small for that, but bigger than any coyote I'd ever seen. The door wasn't locked. Inside, papers were scattered everywhere, Marcus's eclipse notes, weather reports, and old maps of the forest. But what caught my eye was a strange drawing on his kitchen table. It looked like some kind of ancient symbol, drawn over and over again in what looked like. Was that blood? "Bob?" Marcus's voice came from behind me, making me jump. "What are you doing here?" When I turned around, I almost didn't recognize him. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, but there was something else too. The way he moved was different, more like an animal than a person. "You okay, buddy?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Been trying to reach you all evening." He smiled, but it wasn't his usual friendly grin. "Never better," he said. "Just getting ready for tomorrow's show, the eclipse. It's going to be something special." That's when I noticed Rex, Marcus's German shepherd, hiding under the table. Rex had always loved me, but when I tried to pet him, he whimpered and backed away. He was looking at Marcus with pure fear in his eyes. "The animals know," Marcus said, staring out his window at the dark forest. "They can feel it coming, the change, the power." His voice had dropped to almost a whisper. I wanted to ask what he meant, but suddenly every dog in the neighborhood started howling at once. Marcus's head snapped toward the sound, and for a split second, I swear I'm not making this up, his eyes glowed yellow in the dark. "You should go, Bob," he said, still staring out the window. "Tomorrow's going to be a busy day. A very busy day indeed." I left his cabin, but I didn't go home. Instead, I parked my truck at the ranger station and pulled out our old records. Something Marcus had said about the animals knowing bothered me. I started looking through reports of past eclipses in the area, and what I found sent chills down my spine. Every time there had been a blood moon eclipse in these parts, something bad had happened. Cattle mutilations, mass wildlife migrations, people gone missing. And every single time, the reports mentioned the same things: strange symbols, changed behavior, and yellow eyes in the dark. As I sat there reading, a raven landed on my windowsill. It just sat there, staring at me with an intelligence that no bird should have. And somehow, I knew it was watching me for Marcus. The eclipse wasn't just coming, it was bringing something with it, something old, something hungry. And my best friend was right in the middle of it all. The morning of the eclipse, I went back to Marcus's cabin, but he wasn't there. His truck was gone, and so was Rex. What I did find made my stomach turn: dead plants all around his cabin, like something had sucked the life right out of them. Even the grass had turned brown and brittle. I tried calling him, but his phone went straight to voicemail. That's when I started getting more calls from around the forest. Hikers reported seeing packs of coyotes moving together, following them. Campers said ravens were stealing their food, working together like they had a plan. And everyone mentioned the same thing: a tall figure walking through the trees, talking to the animals. I knew it had to be Marcus, but how was he doing it? I grabbed his journal from his cabin, something I'd never normally do, but this wasn't normal anymore. The pages were filled with weird drawings and notes about the blood moon. The last entry caught my eye. They're speaking to me now, all of them. The coyotes, the ravens, even the mice in the walls. They want me to lead them. During the eclipse, we'll be strongest. Bob won't understand. No one will. But they'll see. I drove up to Cinder Hills, where most of the eclipse viewers would be. The parking lot was already filling up with excited tourists. They had no idea what was coming. As I walked around, checking permits, I noticed something scary. Every animal I saw was watching me. Squirrels, birds, even a couple of deer at the edge of the woods. All staring, all still, like they were waiting for orders. Then I saw him. Marcus was standing at the edge of the forest, surrounded by what looked like 30 different animals. Coyotes, ravens, even a mountain lion. They weren't attacking him. They were protecting him. "Marcus," I called out. He turned, and I stepped back. His eyes were completely yellow now and his skin looked gray, like paper. When he smiled, his teeth seemed sharper. "They listen to me now, Bob," he said, his voice rough like gravel. "I can see through their eyes, feel what they feel. There's so many of them, all connected, all mine." A raven landed on his shoulder, and I swear it whispered something in his ear. Marcus nodded like he understood. "The eclipse starts in 6 hours," he said. "When the moon turns red, I'll be able to control people too. Just need to look them in the eye. Think about it, Bob. We could run this whole forest together." "That's not you talking, Marcus," I said. "Something's happened to you. Let me help." He laughed, but it sounded more like a growl. "Help? I'm not sick, Bob. I'm finally awake. And soon, everyone else will be too." The animals around him started getting restless. A coyote snapped at my legs, and I jumped back. Marcus didn't stop it, he just watched, smiling. "Go check the old burial ground at sunset," he said, "where they found those cave paintings last year. If you want to understand, that's where you need to be." Then he walked into the forest, all those animals following him like he was their king. The scary part? More animals joined him as he walked. Rabbits, foxes, even a bear lumbering out of the brush. All following my friend, who wasn't really my friend anymore. My name is Robert Thompson, but everyone around here just calls me Bob. I've been a ranger at Coconino National Forest for nearly 15 years now, though sometimes I still catch myself reaching for a rodeo rope instead of my radio. Funny how old habits stick with you like that. I come from a family of forest rangers. My daddy was one, and his daddy before him. Maybe that's why the forest feels more like home to me than any house ever could. Even with my bow-legged walk, courtesy of too many years riding broncos, I can still outpace most folks on these trails. But what I'm about to tell you, well, it's about something that happened during the blood moon eclipse of '68. Something that changed everything I thought I knew about these woods and the creatures that call them home. It all started when we got word about the upcoming eclipse. The Forest Service was buzzing with preparation. We were expecting hundreds of tourists to flood in for the viewing. Marcus, my partner of 3 years, was especially excited. He'd always been into that science stuff, marking his calendar months in advance and talking nonstop about how this eclipse would be spectacular. I noticed the first signs that something was off about a week before the eclipse. The animals were acting strange, real strange. Now, I've spent enough time in these woods to know when something isn't right. The deer were moving in odd patterns, gathering in places they normally avoided. The birds, especially the ravens, were collecting in numbers I'd never seen before. But it was the coyotes that really got my attention. Usually they keep to themselves, hunting in small family groups. But that week, I started seeing them move together in large packs, working together in ways that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I remember bringing it up to Marcus during our evening patrol. "Something ain't right with the wildlife," I told him. He just laughed it off, said it was probably the approaching eclipse affecting their behavior. But there was something different about his laugh that evening, something that didn't quite sound like the Marcus I knew. Looking back now, I should have paid more attention to the way his hands trembled as he marked our patrol route on the map, or how his eyes seemed to reflect the fading sunlight, just a little too brightly. But you know what they say about hindsight, it's always clearer than a desert sky at noon. As the sun began to set that evening, we heard the first howls. Not your regular coyote calls. These were deeper, more purposeful, almost like they were speaking to each other. And the way Marcus's head snapped toward the sound, well, that was the moment I first felt that cold knot of fear in my gut, the one that told me we were about to face something bigger than anything my years of ranger training had prepared me for. Little did I know, that sunset was just the beginning of the longest night of my life, a night that would test not just my courage, but also my understanding of the natural world, and my loyalty to a friend who was slowly becoming something else entirely. That night, I couldn't sleep. The howling kept getting louder, and my phone wouldn't stop ringing with calls from worried locals. They all had the same story: animals acting weird, pets going missing, livestock getting spooked for no reason. Around midnight, I decided to check on Marcus. He hadn't answered any of my radio calls since our evening patrol. When I pulled up to his cabin, something felt off. All the lights were on, but the curtains were drawn. His truck was there, but his dog, Rex, who usually barked at everything that moved, was dead quiet. "Marcus?" I called out, climbing his porch steps. My flashlight beam caught something odd: claw marks on his doorframe, fresh ones. Not from a bear, too small for that, but bigger than any coyote I'd ever seen. The door wasn't locked. Inside, papers were scattered everywhere: Marcus's eclipse notes, weather reports, and old maps of the forest. But what caught my eye was a strange drawing on his kitchen table. It looked like some kind of ancient symbol, drawn over and over again in what looked like. Was that blood? "Bob?" Marcus's voice came from behind me, making me jump. "What are you doing here?" When I turned around, I almost didn't recognize him. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, but there was something else too. The way he moved was different, more like an animal than a person. "You okay, buddy?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Been trying to reach you all evening." He smiled, but it wasn't his usual friendly grin. "Never better," he said. "Just getting ready for tomorrow's show, the eclipse. It's going to be something special." That's when I noticed Rex, Marcus's German shepherd, hiding under the table. Rex had always loved me, but when I tried to pet him, he whimpered and backed away. He was looking at Marcus with pure fear in his eyes. "The animals know," Marcus said, staring out his window at the dark forest. "They can feel it coming, the change, the power." His voice had dropped to almost a whisper. I wanted to ask what he meant, but suddenly every dog in the neighborhood started howling at once. Marcus's head snapped toward the sound, and for a split second, I swear I'm not making this up, his eyes glowed yellow in the dark. "You should go, Bob," he said, still staring out the window. "Tomorrow's going to be a busy day. A very busy day indeed." I left his cabin, but I didn't go home. Instead, I parked my truck at the ranger station and pulled out our old records. Something Marcus had said about the animals knowing bothered me. I started looking through reports of past eclipses in the area, and what I found sent chills down my spine. Every time there had been a blood moon eclipse in these parts, something bad had happened. Cattle mutilations, mass wildlife migrations, people gone missing. And every single time, the reports mentioned the same things: strange symbols, changed behavior, and yellow eyes in the dark. As I sat there reading, a raven landed on my windowsill. It just sat there, staring at me with an intelligence that no bird should have. And somehow, I knew it was watching me for Marcus. The eclipse wasn't just coming, it was bringing something with it, something old, something hungry. And my best friend was right in the middle of it all. The morning of the eclipse, I went back to Marcus's cabin, but he wasn't there. His truck was gone, and so was Rex. What I did find made my stomach turn: dead plants all around his cabin, like something had sucked the life right out of them. Even the grass had turned brown and brittle. I tried calling him, but his phone went straight to voicemail. That's when I started getting more calls from around the forest. Hikers reported seeing packs of coyotes moving together, following them. Campers said ravens were stealing their food, working together like they had a plan. And everyone mentioned the same thing: a tall figure walking through the trees, talking to the animals. I knew it had to be Marcus, but how was he doing it? I grabbed his journal from his cabin, something I'd never normally do, but this wasn't normal anymore. The pages were filled with weird drawings and notes about the blood moon. The last entry caught my eye. They're speaking to me now. All of them. The coyotes, the ravens, even the mice in the walls. They want me to lead them. During the eclipse, we'll be strongest. Bob won't understand. No one will. But they'll see. I drove up to Cinder Hills, where most of the eclipse viewers would be. The parking lot was already filling up with excited tourists. They had no idea what was coming. As I walked around, checking permits, I noticed something scary. Every animal I saw was watching me. Squirrels, birds, even a couple of deer at the edge of the woods. All staring, all still, like they were waiting for orders. Then I saw him. Marcus was standing at the edge of the forest, surrounded by what looked like 30 different animals. Coyotes, ravens, even a mountain lion. They weren't attacking him. They were protecting him. "Marcus," I called out. He turned, and I stepped back. His eyes were completely yellow now, and his skin looked gray, like paper. When he smiled, his teeth seemed sharper. "They listen to me now, Bob," he said, his voice rough like gravel. "I can see through their eyes, feel what they feel. There's so many of them, all connected, all mine." A raven landed on his shoulder, and I swear it whispered something in his ear. Marcus nodded like he understood. "The eclipse starts in 6 hours, he said. "When the moon turns red, I'll be able to control people too. Just need to look them in the eye. Think about it, Bob. We could run this whole forest together." "That's not you talking, Marcus," I said. "Something's happened to you. Let me help." He laughed, but it sounded more like a growl. "Help? I'm not sick, Bob. I'm finally awake. And soon, everyone else will be too." The animals around him started getting restless. A coyote snapped at my legs, and I jumped back. Marcus didn't stop it, he just watched, smiling. "Go check the old burial ground at sunset," he said, "where they found those cave paintings last year. If you want to understand, that's where you need to be." Then he walked into the forest, all those animals following him like he was their king. The scary part? More animals joined him as he walked. Rabbits, foxes, even a bear lumbering out of the brush. All following my friend, who wasn't really my friend anymore. My name is Frank Patterson, and I've been a forest ranger here in Huron-Manistee for 25 years. The trees, trails, and lakes of this place are as familiar to me as the wrinkles on my weathered face. But what happened during the bicentennial weekend of 1976 changed everything I thought I knew about these woods. I remember that weekend like it was yesterday. The forest was packed with more visitors than we'd ever seen before. Families in colorful tents, kids running around with sparklers, and the smell of campfires everywhere. Everyone was excited about celebrating America's 200th birthday, but none of them knew the darkness that was about to unfold. You see, I've always had a personal reason for watching these woods so carefully. Back in '46, when I was just 22, my younger brother Tom disappeared here. They said it was a wolf attack, but I never believed that story. The way his belongings were scattered, the strange tracks we found, and those horrible sounds in the night. Sounds that seemed to call out in my brother's voice, even though we never found his body. That 4th of July weekend started normal enough. I was doing my usual patrol, checking on campers, making sure no one was getting too wild with their fireworks. The sun was setting, painting the sky in beautiful oranges and reds. Kids were laughing, hot dogs were roasting, and patriotic music played from portable radios. I remember thinking how perfect it all seemed. Then Jerry, one of our newer rangers, radioed in about a missing teenager from Campsite 7. Sarah Miller, age 16, had gone to collect more firewood just before dark and never came back. Her family was frantic. We started a standard search pattern, thinking she had just lost her way in the growing darkness. But something felt wrong. The crickets and frogs had gone quiet. You notice these things after 25 years in the forest. And then I heard it, a voice calling out, "Help, I'm over here." It sounded exactly like a teenage girl, exactly like Sarah Miller. The thing is, the voice was coming from the opposite direction of where her footprints led, and when I followed those footprints with my flashlight, they stopped suddenly in the middle of a clearing. Right next to them were claw marks in the dirt, marks that made my blood run cold. They were just like the ones we found 30 years ago when Tom disappeared. That was just the beginning of the longest weekend of my life. By midnight, 2 more people would vanish, and I would finally learn the truth about what really happened to my brother, a truth that had been hiding in these woods for over 100 years. But let me tell you exactly how it all unfolded, because people need to know what's really out there in the dark. By midnight, our small ranger station was buzzing with activity. 3 families had set up their tents near Sarah Miller's campsite, and they all told the same strange story. Before Sarah disappeared, they'd heard her laughing and talking with what sounded like her mom near the tree line. But here's the thing. Her mom had been at the campsite the whole time, trying to get their campfire started. I sat at my desk, looking through old files with shaking hands. You see, something about this seemed familiar, too familiar. I pulled out the yellowed report from 1946, the one about Tom. The similarities made my stomach turn. Witnesses back then said they'd heard Tom calling out to his friends, but from 2 different directions at once. Then Jerry burst through the door, his face white as a sheet. "Frank, you need to hear this." He played a recording on his radio. He'd been smart enough to record what he'd heard while searching the East Trail. What I heard made the hair on my neck stand up. It was Sarah's voice, clear as day, calling out, "Mom? Dad? I see your flashlights." But then, overlapping it, was another voice, an older woman's voice, calling, "Sarah, honey, come this way." Both voices were coming from the same source, but that's not possible. No human can speak with 2 voices at once. While we were listening to the tape, another call came in. 2 more campers had vanished, a father and son who'd gone to investigate strange noises outside their tent. Just like with Sarah, their belongings were scattered in a clearing. But this time, we found something else. Their flashlight was still on, pointing at deep claw marks in a tree trunk. The marks were fresh and higher up than any bear could reach. I knew I had to dig deeper. In the back of our files, there was a locked cabinet that hadn't been opened in years. Inside, I found reports dating back to 1876. Every 50 years, like clockwork, people had gone missing in these woods, always during large gatherings, always at night, and always with reports of strange voices. The oldest report included a warning from the local Ojibwe tribe. They'd called this place the Woods of Many Voices, and warned settlers not to camp here during what they called the hungry time, every 50 years when the stars aligned in a certain way. But there was something else, something that made my blood run cold. Attached to the report was a page stamped "Classified" in faded red ink. It detailed how the government had covered up similar incidents, not just here but in other forests too. They blamed bears, wolves, anything but what the evidence actually pointed to. I was starting to put the pieces together, but I didn't like the picture they were making. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just some wild animal. It was intelligent. It was organized. And based on the 50-year pattern, it was hungry. The radio crackled again. Another voice in the darkness. This time it was calling my name, and it sounded exactly like Tom, hearing Tom's voice after 30 years. I can't really describe how that felt. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold my flashlight. But I knew one thing. Whatever was using my brother's voice was trying to lure me in, just like it had done to the others. Jerry wanted to call in the state police, but I knew they wouldn't believe us. Heck, I barely believed it myself. But I had to find those missing people, and I had to know what happened to Tom. So I gathered my gear, my rifle, extra flashlights, rope, and a handheld radio. That's when we noticed something odd about the claw marks we'd found. They weren't random. Looking at them carefully, they seemed to point in the same direction, leading deeper into the oldest part of the forest. We followed them, and each set of marks was fresher than the last. The voices kept calling out to us as we walked. Sometimes it was Sarah, sometimes the father and son, sometimes Tom. They echoed through the trees, getting closer and closer. But the strangest part? The voices were starting to mix together, like a terrible choir of people calling for help. Then we found it, a cave entrance, hidden behind thick bushes. The claw marks led right to it. The opening was huge, way bigger than any natural cave should be, and the air coming out was ice cold even though it was July. Our flashlight beams showed that this wasn't just some random cave. The walls were smooth, almost like something had carved them out. And there were more claw marks here, but different. Some looked ancient, and others seemed fresh. They weren't just marks either. They were more like signs. Like whatever made them was smart enough to leave messages. As we went deeper, we found things that made my stomach turn. Torn backpacks from different decades, old camping gear, and carved into the walls were symbols that matched the ones in those classified files. The same warnings the Ojibwe had tried to give 100 years ago. That's when we heard it. Not voices this time, but something worse. A sound like claws scraping on stone, coming from multiple tunnels at once. And breathing. Heavy breathing that didn't sound human at all. Our flashlights caught movement in one of the tunnels. What we saw, I still see it in my nightmares. It was tall, much taller than a person, with long arms that ended in massive claws. But its face was what got me. It looked almost human, but wrong. And when it opened its mouth, out came Tom's voice. "Frank, help me." But it wasn't alone. More shapes moved in the darkness behind it, more eyes reflecting our flashlight beams. They had us surrounded, and they'd been hunting humans like this for centuries. Jerry's radio crackled. More people were missing from the campgrounds above. These things were still hunting, even while we were in their den. We had to make a choice, try to run, or face them here in their own lair. I'd been carrying something in my pack that I hadn't told Jerry about, demolition charges from the ranger station. We used them for clearing fallen trees and rocky areas. I never thought I'd use them for something like this. "Jerry," I whispered, "when I give the signal, run back the way we came. Don't stop, don't look back." The creatures were closing in. In the flashlight beams, I could see them better now. Some walked on 2 legs, others on 4, but they all moved with a terrible grace. Their skin looked like old leather, and their eyes showed an intelligence that scared me more than their claws. One of them picked up a fallen flashlight, studied it for a moment, then clicked it on and off. Another grabbed a radio from a torn backpack, mimicking the static sounds perfectly. They weren't just animals. They were learning, adapting, using our own tools against us. That's when I saw something that made my blood freeze. In a corner of the cave, partially hidden behind a boulder, was a familiar leather wallet. I'd given it to Tom for his 16th birthday. These monsters had kept it as some kind of trophy, just like they'd kept things from all their victims. The anger that filled me then was like nothing I'd ever felt before. 30 years of wondering, of blame, of fear. It all came down to this moment. I pulled out the first charge while they watched, curious about this new object. "You want to see what this is?" I called out to them. "Come closer then." They did, moving forward with their strange, fluid grace. I saw more of them emerging from side tunnels, dozens of them, more than I'd ever imagined could exist down here. "Jerry, run!" I shouted, throwing my flashlight at the nearest creature. In the chaos that followed, I heard Jerry's footsteps fading as he sprinted for the exit. Good. At least one of us had to survive to tell the truth. The creatures realized something was wrong. They started moving faster, their calls changing from mimicked human voices to something much more primitive and terrifying. But I was ready. I'd already planned where to place the charges, at key points in the tunnel structure that would bring the whole thing down. I ran deeper into their lair, placing charges as I went. They followed, but they were cautious now. They knew something was different about this prey. I could hear them in the darkness, moving through tunnels above and beside me, trying to cut me off. My flashlight caught glimpses of their underground world, piles of belongings from decades of victims, strange markings on the walls that looked like maps or plans, And worst of all, evidence that they were getting smarter with each generation. I reached the deepest chamber, where the main tunnels all came together. This was it. No going back now. I could hear them coming from every direction, their calls echoing off the walls. I placed the last charge, set the timer, and took out my radio. I clicked on my radio one last time. My hands were steady now. Strange how calm you can feel when you know what you have to do. Jerry, if you can hear me, I want you to tell them what's really out here. Tell them about the tunnels, the voices, everything. They need to know. The creatures were so close now I could smell them. A strange mix of wet earth and something older, something that didn't belong in our world. Their eyes gleamed in the darkness, dozens of them, watching me from every tunnel. One of them stepped forward. It was bigger than the others, and when it opened its mouth, it spoke with all the voices it had stolen over the years. I heard Tom's voice in there, and Sarah's, and so many others, all crying out at once. "You're not going to hurt anyone else," I told it. "Not ever again." I looked at my watch. 20 seconds left on the charges. The creature tilted its head, like it was trying to understand. Maybe it did understand. Maybe that's what made these things so dangerous. They were smart enough to know exactly what they were doing. 15 seconds. They must have sensed something was wrong, because they all started moving at once, their claws scraping against the stone as they rushed toward me. But it was too late. 10 seconds. I thought about Tom, about all the others who'd been taken over the years, about the families who never knew what really happened to their loved ones. 5 seconds. "This is for my brother," I whispered. The first explosion rocked the cavern, then another and another. The creatures screamed, not with human voices now, but with their real ones. The sound was like nothing I'd ever heard before, and I hope nobody ever has to hear it again. The ceiling started coming down. Rocks crashed around me as the tunnels collapsed. The last thing I saw was those creatures trying to escape, but they had nowhere to go. I'd placed the charges too well. This was their tomb, and mine too. They never found my body. Jerry made it out and told them everything, just like I asked. The official report says I was lost in a cave-in while pursuing dangerous animals. They still won't admit what was really down there. But the forest remembers. Every few years, hikers report strange voices in the night. Some say they've seen claw marks on trees, way too high up for any normal animal. The rangers put up new warning signs, telling people not to go into the caves, not that anyone can find those tunnels anymore. They say if you camp in Huron-Manistee on quiet nights, you might hear voices calling from the woods. Some sound like children, some like adults, and some people swear they've heard an old ranger's voice, warning them to stay away from the dark places in the forest. Maybe some of those creatures survived. Maybe they're down there still, in tunnels we haven't found yet, waiting for another 50 years to pass. Or maybe they're gone for good. But I did what I had to do. For Tom, for Sarah, for all of them. And if you're ever in these woods at night, and you hear a voice calling your name, don't answer, don't follow. Just remember my story and run. The end. My name is Michael Harrison, and I've spent the last 12 years doing winter rescue operations in White Mountain National Forest. You'd think after all this time, the mountains would have shown me everything they had to offer. But what happened during those 3 days in December 1994 proved me dead wrong. I remember every detail like it was yesterday. The wind had been acting strange that week, blowing in patterns I'd never seen before. The night seemed darker than usual too, stretching on for what felt like forever. 20 hours of darkness might be normal for Alaska, but not here in Maine. Something just felt off. Max, my German Shepherd partner, noticed it first. He's usually the calmest rescue dog you'll ever meet, steady as a rock in any situation. But that week, he kept staring into the shadows and growling at nothing. I should have taken it as a warning sign. Animals always know when something's not right. It started with a routine call about a missing ski party. 3 people who hadn't checked in at their lodge. Nothing we hadn't handled 100 times before. The forecast showed clear skies, and even though it was cold, conditions were perfect for a rescue operation. That's what I kept telling myself anyway. I gathered my team, 6 of us total, all experienced winter rescue specialists. We had all the latest gear: thermal imaging, satellite phones, emergency beacons, the works. Sarah was our medical expert. Tom handled communications. Mike and John were our best climbers, and Lisa was our local guide. With Max leading the way, we were as prepared as any rescue team could be. But none of that mattered when we saw those shadows on the snow. They moved wrong, like ink spreading through water, but against the wind. Max saw them too. He stopped dead in his tracks, the fur on his neck standing straight up, and let out a whine I'd never heard from him before. That's when I first felt it. That creeping sensation that we weren't just looking for lost skiers anymore. We were dealing with something else entirely. The aurora borealis danced overhead, painting the sky in greens and purples. Beautiful, except it shouldn't have been visible this far south. Nature itself seemed to be breaking its own rules, and we were about to find out why. Tom was the first to vanish. 1 minute he was right behind me, checking our coordinates on the GPS. The next, nothing. Just empty air where a person should have been, and his footprints in the snow ending mid-step. No sound, no struggle, no warning, just gone. That's when our real nightmare began. The 5 of us huddled together after Tom disappeared. Sarah kept saying we should call for backup, but our satellite phones only gave us static. Even our regular radios were dead. The wind had picked up, and the temperature dropped so fast our breath froze in front of our faces. "We need to find shelter," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But inside, my heart was racing. In all my years of rescue work, I'd never lost a team member. Never. The old ranger cabin should be about half a mile east. We'll regroup there. Max stayed close to my side, his body tense. Every few steps he'd stop and stare into the darkness, his ears twitching. I trusted his instincts more than any piece of equipment we had. Something was out there, watching us. I could feel it. The shadows seemed to follow us. Not our own shadows, these were different. They moved when they shouldn't, stretched in impossible directions. John pointed his flashlight at one, and the beam just disappeared, like the darkness was eating the light. "Look at the snow," Lisa whispered, pointing at the ground around us. She was right. There was something wrong with it. Our footprints were vanishing just seconds after we made them, filled in by snow that fell straight up from the ground. I'd seen every kind of weird weather pattern in these mountains, but nothing like this. Mike checked his watch and frowned. "We've been walking for 20 minutes. That cabin should be right here." He was right. I knew these mountains like the back of my hand, but somehow everything looked different. The trees were in the wrong places. Paths that should have been there weren't. Then came the whispers. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but wind doesn't call your name. Wind doesn't laugh. And wind definitely doesn't sound like someone you know who shouldn't be there. "Did anyone else hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. It sounded like Tom. Before I could answer, John's flashlight beam caught something in the trees ahead. A figure, tall and dark, standing perfectly still. It looked human, but wrong, like a shadow that had peeled itself off the ground and stood up. Max started growling, low and deep in his throat. I reached down to grip his collar, as much to steady myself as to hold him back. The figure didn't move, but somehow it seemed to get closer anyway. "Nobody move," I whispered. "Stay together." That's when John screamed. I spun around just in time to see the snow at his feet turn black. It was like watching someone fall through thin ice, except the darkness swallowed him whole. 1 second he was there, the next, just his flashlight spinning in the snow. We ran. There's no shame in admitting it. We ran as fast as we could through the deep snow, our training forgotten, our equipment dropping behind us. The only clear thought in my head was keeping my team, what was left of it, alive. But in the White Mountains, in December, when something impossible is hunting you, running might be the worst thing you can do. Running in deep snow is like trying to sprint through water. It wears you out fast. After what felt like forever, we had to stop. My lungs were burning from the cold air, and my legs felt like lead. Mike, Sarah, and Lisa weren't doing any better. Only Mac seemed to still have energy, but he wouldn't leave my side. We need to think," I gasped, trying to catch my breath. "This isn't helping." The darkness around us was different now, thicker. The kind of dark that makes you doubt your own eyes. Our remaining flashlights barely lit up the space in front of us, like the batteries were dying, except we just put in new ones that morning. "Michael," Lisa said quietly, "look at your watch." I glanced down at my digital watch. The numbers were jumping around randomly, 12:47, 3:22, 9:15, all in the span of seconds. Mike checked his too, same thing. That's when it hit me. We had no idea how long we'd been out here. Sarah pulled out her compass, then threw it in the snow in frustration. "It's useless. The needle won't stop spinning." A sound echoed through the trees, like ice cracking, but deeper. Much deeper. Max's ears perked up, and he turned in a circle, trying to track it. The noise seemed to come from everywhere at once. "We need to mark our path," I said, pulling out my rescue rope. "Tie ourselves together. Nobody else disappears." Even as I said it, frost started creeping up the rope, making it stiff and brittle. Mike pointed up at the sky. "The aurora. It's gone." He was right. The colorful lights that had been dancing overhead had vanished, leaving nothing but a starless void above us. Then the snow started falling, not from the sky, from the ground up. It swirled around our feet like tiny tornadoes, forming shapes that almost looked like hands reaching for our legs. "Don't look at them," I ordered, remembering how John had disappeared. "Keep your eyes on each other." Sarah screamed suddenly, pointing behind me. I spun around and saw what had scared her. There were eyes in the darkness between the trees, not animal eyes. These were different. They absorbed light instead of reflecting it, like holes punched in the night itself. "The flares?" Lisa said. "We still have the emergency flares." I nodded, pulling one from my pack with shaking hands. The thing about fear, real fear, is that it makes simple things hard, like trying to strike a flare with gloved hands that won't stop trembling. The eyes were getting closer. Or maybe we were getting closer to them. It was impossible to tell anymore. The darkness seemed to bend and twist around us, making distances meaningless. Finally, I got the flare lit. The red light pushed back the darkness for a moment, and we saw something, a shape that shouldn't exist. Like a piece of night had torn loose and learned to move. It retreated from the light, but I knew it wasn't gone. "We've got 5 more flares," I said, trying to sound calmer than I felt. "We need to make them last." That's when we heard Lisa's voice behind us. "Help me." But Lisa was standing right next to me. Mike turned toward the voice, the fake voice, and took one step away from our group. He was gone before any of us could grab him. 3 of us left now, me, Sarah, Lisa, and Max. The cold was getting worse, biting through our layers of winter gear like they were made of paper. But it wasn't a normal kind of cold. This felt hungry. "We can't stay here," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "But we can't keep moving either. What do we do, Michael?" Before I could answer, Max started whining. Not his usual alert whine, this was different, scared. He pressed against my legs, looking up at the sky. Following his gaze, I saw why. The darkness was falling like a curtain. Not normal night darkness. This was complete. The kind where you can't even see your hand in front of your face. It moved like a wall coming down, eating up the trees ahead of us one by one. "Flares," I said, fumbling in my pack. "Everyone light a flare. Now." The red light pushed back the darkness, creating a small circle of safety around us. But our hands were shaking so bad, Sarah dropped hers in the snow. When she bent to pick it up, she screamed. Her shadow was moving by itself, not following her movements, but twisting away from her body like a snake made of darkness. As we watched, frozen in horror, it began to pull away from her feet. "Sarah, don't move!" I shouted, but it was too late. She tried to step back, and her shadow wrapped around her legs like black smoke. The last thing I heard was her crying out my name before the darkness took her. Lisa grabbed my arm so hard it hurt. "Michael, look at the trees." The trees around us were changing. Their shadows stretched out like long fingers, reaching for us. Even worse, I could see things moving in those shadows. Things that looked almost human, but moved all wrong, like puppets with broken strings. Max barked, his deep, serious bark that meant real trouble. Through the red light of our flares, I saw more eyes opening in the darkness. Dozens of them, hundreds, all around us. That's when I remembered something. Something important about today's date. "It's the winter solstice," I whispered. "The longest night of the year." Lisa's face went pale. "The missing ski party. We never found any sign of them, did we?" She was right. No tracks, no equipment, no distress signals. Almost like they never existed, I finished her thought. Like it was just a way to lure us out here. Our flares were starting to die, the red light getting weaker. The darkness crept closer, and with it came that sound again, like ice cracking. But now I could tell it was something else. It was laughing. Lisa's flashlight caught movement in the snow, more shadows rising up like black smoke, forming shapes that looked almost like people. But their movements were jerky, unnatural. "They're surrounding us," Lisa whispered. I felt Max tense beside me, his growl rumbling through his chest. He was staring at something behind Lisa, his ears flat against his head. I started to shout a warning, but the words froze in my throat, because Lisa's shadow had just stood up behind her and reached out with hands made of darkness. I lunged for Lisa, but I was too late. Her shadow wrapped around her like black smoke, and she vanished with a scream that cut off too quickly. Now it was just me and Max, surrounded by darkness that shouldn't exist. Our last flare was dying, its red light getting weaker by the second. The eyes in the darkness moved closer. They weren't just watching anymore, they were hunting. Max pressed against my leg, his whole body trembling but still ready to fight. That's when I realized something. The shadows couldn't move into the light. Not even our weak, dying light. They had to wait for the darkness to reach us. I had one flare left in my pack, one chance. The thing about rescue work is that sometimes you have to make impossible choices, fast. Looking at Max, I knew what I had to do. "Stay close, boy," I whispered, pulling out the last flare with shaking hands. The cold was so bad now, I could barely feel my fingers. The darkness pressed closer, forming shapes that looked like my missing team members, but wrong, like photographs that had melted. They were trying to trick me again, using voices I knew. I heard Sarah calling for help, Tom saying he'd found the missing ski party, Lisa begging me to save her. But their voices came from the wrong places, echoing like they were coming from the bottom of a deep hole. The last flare sputtered and died. Total darkness hit like a physical wave. I couldn't see anything, not even Max right next to me. But I could hear them coming, the soft sound of shadow feet on snow, moving closer from all sides. That's when Max started barking, not at the shadows but at the sky. I looked up and saw it. The moon was peeking through the clouds, just a sliver, but getting brighter as the clouds moved. The shadows saw it too. They started moving faster, more desperately. I felt cold hands grabbing at my jacket, trying to pull me into the darkness. With numb fingers, I struck the final flare. The red light exploded outward just as moonlight broke through the clouds. And there, caught between the two lights, I finally saw what was hunting us. It was like looking at a tear in the world, a piece of emptiness that had learned to think, to hunt. It had no real shape, it kept changing, like smoke in the wind, but made of pure darkness. And those eyes, those horrible eyes that swallowed light. Max launched himself at the creature, his teeth finding something solid in all that darkness. The thing made a sound like shattering ice, thrashing as it tried to shake him off. I held the flare high, forcing the creature back. The moonlight grew stronger, and where the two lights met, the shadow thing began to break apart, like paper burning from two sides at once. It screamed. The sound shook snow from the trees and made the ground tremble. Then it just fell apart, dissolved into normal shadows that melted away in the moonlight. The normal darkness of night rushed back in, replacing that awful, living darkness. I could see stars again, real stars. Max limped back to me, his fur covered in frost but otherwise okay. Together we watched the sun rise on December 22nd, turning the snow pink and orange, making everything look normal again. But normal was a lie now. We both knew it. They found us the next morning, Max and me, still sitting in that clearing. The rescue team had tons of questions. Where was our equipment? Where was the rest of my team? What happened to the missing ski party? I told them everything, every impossible detail. They wrote it all down, nodding and taking pictures of the strange frost patterns in the snow. But I could see it in their eyes. They didn't believe me. Not really. The official report called it an avalanche, said my team got caught in it, and I was probably confused from hypothermia. They wrote that the ski party was never really missing, just a mix-up with the lodge's records, everything wrapped up nice and neat. But they couldn't explain why the ground radar showed no bodies under the snow, or why all our satellite phones failed at exactly the same time, or why the weather station recorded 20 hours of darkness that night when it should have been 15. I quit rescue work a month later, took a desk job training new recruits. Max retired with me. He wouldn't go into the mountains with anyone else anyway. Some nights, when the moon is hidden and the shadows in my room look a little too dark, he still growls at nothing. Sarah's family put up a memorial. So did Tom's, John's, Lisa's, and Mike's. 5 empty graves for 5 people who disappeared into shadows that shouldn't exist. I visit them sometimes, when I need to remind myself it was all real. The thing about darkness is that once you've seen it move, seen it think, seen it hunt, you never really trust it again. Every time the sun sets, I wonder if this will be the night it comes back. If this time, the shadows will remember me. Last week, I got a letter from another rescue worker in Alaska. He described something that made my blood run cold, moving shadows, 20-hour nights, and strange lights in the sky. Asked if I'd ever seen anything like it. I burned his letter, deleted his email, changed my phone number. Because some things, once they notice you, never really let you go. And the darkness, it's patient. It can wait. Max is growling at the window now. The sun is setting, and tonight is the longest night of the year. I think I'll keep the lights on. My name is David Walsh, and I've been tracking things for most of my life. First in the Army, where I learned to follow enemy trails through dense jungles, and later as a wildlife expert, studying how animals move and behave. But nothing in my 41 years prepared me for what I found in Mount Hood National Forest back in September 1985. It all started when I got a call from the local rangers about some strange rock paintings they'd found. Usually I wouldn't get involved in something like that, but these weren't your typical ancient artwork. The paintings showed something that made my skin crawl, a creature that seemed to be changing from human to animal and back again. Next to these paintings were old wooden totems, carved with warnings in languages I didn't understand. I knew I needed help understanding what these meant, so I visited Thomas Blackhawk, an elderly member of the local tribe. When I showed him photos of the paintings, his usual friendly smile disappeared. He sat quiet for a long time, just staring at the images. "These are warnings," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Our ancestors left them to protect us from the skinwalker, a creature that steals faces and lives. He told me stories passed down through generations about a being that could look like anyone it wanted, hunting people during the full moon. I probably would have written it off as just interesting folklore if it weren't for what happened next. 3 teenagers went missing near Spirit Lake: Josh Martinez, Sarah Chen, and Mike Patterson, all local high school kids who'd gone camping for the weekend. Their parents were worried sick, and the rangers found their campsite in a mess. What really caught my attention was their camera, left behind on a log. The photos started normal enough selfies, pictures of their tent, sunset shots over the lake. But the last few images made my blood run cold. They showed something moving in the trees, something that looked almost human but not quite. In the very last photo, there was a face peering out from behind a tree, but it was wrong. The eyes were too big, the smile too wide, like someone trying to copy a human face, but getting the details just a bit off. I've seen a lot of strange things in my years tracking, but this was different. The weird paintings, the elders' warnings, and now these photos, they all pointed to something I couldn't explain. And those missing kids, they were out there somewhere, possibly still alive. The local police were treating it like a normal missing persons case, but I knew better. All those cases I'd been looking into across the country, the mysterious disappearances, the strange sightings, the stories that never quite made sense, they all had pieces of what I was seeing here. As I stood at their campsite that first morning, watching the sun rise through the pine trees, I knew this wasn't going to be a normal search and rescue mission. The tracks I found told a story that shouldn't have been possible. Some looked human, others like a large animal, but they seemed to switch from one to the other mid-stride. And there was something else, the way the branches were broken, how the ground was disturbed. It showed signs of intelligence, not just animal behavior. I pulled out my old army compass and checked my gear. Whatever was out there in those woods, whatever had taken those kids, I was going to find it. I just didn't know then how much this case would change my life, or how deep the horror really went. The forest was quiet that morning, too quiet. No birds singing, no squirrels chattering. Nature knows when something isn't right, and every instinct I had from years in the wilderness was screaming that same warning. Something was out there, watching, waiting. And as the sun climbed higher in the sky, I began my search, not knowing I was about to uncover a truth darker than any ghost story or campfire tale. I spent that first day following the teens' trail through the forest. Years of tracking had taught me to notice things others might miss. A broken twig here, a scuffed footprint there. But something felt off about these tracks. They started normal enough, 3 sets of hiking boots heading toward the lake, but then things got weird. This doesn't make sense, I muttered to myself, kneeling down to study a footprint. It started as a Nike sneaker print, but halfway through, it changed. The front looked like a shoe, but the back looked like some kind of animal paw. I'd never seen anything like it in all my years of tracking. I called together a search party, me, 2 local rangers, and a police officer named Sarah Martinez. We spread out, keeping within shouting distance of each other. The sun was getting lower, casting long shadows through the trees. That's when we found their campsite. The tent was still standing, but something had torn one side open from the outside. Sleeping bags were scattered around, and I noticed half-eaten granola bars and trail mix spilled everywhere. But it was their backpacks that really bothered me. They weren't just tossed around, they'd been carefully gone through. Whatever did this wasn't just an animal, it had been looking for something. "Walsh, over here," Sarah called out. She was holding the teen's camera, the one we'd found earlier. We looked through the photos again, this time on her larger police laptop. The last few pictures were still the creepiest, but now we could see more details. In one photo, Josh and Sarah Chen were smiling at the campfire. But in the background, partially hidden behind a tree, there was a face. It looked almost human, but its eyes, they reflected the light like an animal's. Maybe it's just the flash, Officer Martinez said, but I could hear the doubt in her voice. As we kept searching, I found something that made my stomach turn. There were marks on the trees, but not like any animal scratches I'd seen before. They were patterns, circles, and strange symbols carved into the bark. They reminded me of the warning totems we'd found earlier. The sun was setting when we heard it, a sound that wasn't quite human and wasn't quite animal, like someone trying to copy a wolf's howl but not getting it quite right. Officer Martinez reached for her gun. The rangers looked at each other nervously. "We should head back," one of the rangers said. "It'll be dark soon." But I couldn't leave. Not yet. Because right then, I spotted something hanging from a branch, a friendship bracelet. Sarah Chen's mother had shown me a picture of her wearing it. But there was something else about it that made my heart race. It wasn't just hanging there. It had been placed there, carefully tied in a way no animal could manage. "Whatever took these kids," I said quietly, "it's smart. It's learning about them, using their things too, to understand them." That's when we heard twigs snapping nearby. We all turned, flashlights pointing toward the sound. Through the trees, I caught a glimpse of movement, a figure walking on two legs, but not quite right. Its movements were jerky, like it was still learning how to walk like a human. "Hello?" Officer Martinez called out, her voice steady despite everything. "This is the police." The figure stopped. For a moment, everything was completely silent. Then it turned toward us, and in the beam of our flashlights, we saw a face that looked almost exactly like Mike Patterson's yearbook photo. Almost, but not quite. The smile was too wide, the head tilted at an impossible angle. Then it vanished into the darkness, moving faster than anything I'd ever seen. We stood there frozen, our flashlights shaking slightly. Nobody wanted to say what we'd all just seen. Nobody wanted to admit that maybe those old tribal warnings weren't just stories after all. "We need backup," Officer Martinez finally said, her voice barely a whisper. "We need a lot of backup." But as I stood there in the growing darkness, I knew regular backup wouldn't be enough. We were dealing with something that broke every rule I thought I knew about tracking and hunting. And somehow, I had to figure out how to find it before it was too late for those kids. That night, none of us slept much. We set up a base camp near the ranger station, and I spent hours looking through old files and newspapers on my laptop. There was a pattern I hadn't noticed before. Every year, right around the harvest moon, people went missing in forests across the country. Some were never found. Others turned up weeks later, acting strange, not quite themselves. I called Thomas Blackhawk early the next morning. The old tribal elder wasn't surprised to hear about what we'd seen. "It's getting bolder," he said, his voice heavy with worry. "The creature. It needs to feed during the harvest moon. But it's not just about eating. It wants to understand us, to be like us. Each victim teaches it more about being human." "How do we stop it?" I asked. "Water," he said. "Running water. It can't cross streams or rivers, and when it changes shape, that's when it's weakest. The change happens every 6 hours, and it can't control when. Watch for blood. Blood triggers the change." I wrote everything down, my hand shaking slightly. It all sounded crazy, but after what we'd seen in the forest, I couldn't ignore it. Officer Martinez joined me for the morning search. We found more tracks, and this time they told an even stranger story. The creature had been using the teens' camping gear. There were marks where it had set up traps using their ropes and tools. "Look at this," I said, pointing to some markings on a tree. "These aren't random. It's learning, taking notes, like it's studying us." We followed the tracks to a small clearing. That's where we found one of Mike's notebooks. Pages were torn out, but not in anger. They had been carefully removed, like someone was trying to learn from them. Practice sentences were scratched into the dirt nearby. Someone or something trying to learn how to write. "Walsh," Martinez whispered, pointing to a tree. Carved into the bark was a perfect copy of Sarah Chen's signature. The wind picked up, carrying with it a strange smell like wet fur and something metallic. Then we heard it, Someone calling for help in Mike's voice. It was coming from deeper in the forest. "Mike?" Martinez called back. "Help! Please!" The voice was perfect, exactly like Mike's. Too perfect. I grabbed Martinez's arm before she could run toward it. "Wait," I whispered. "Remember what we saw yesterday? It can copy them." That's when we heard another voice, Sarah Chen's this time, coming from the opposite direction. Two identical cries for help, from two different places. It was impossible. We backed away slowly, keeping our eyes on the trees around us. The voices got louder, more desperate. Then they changed. The words stayed the same, but the voices started to sound wrong, like a recording being played at the wrong speed. Back at base camp, I marked everything we knew on a map. The creature couldn't cross running water. That gave us some boundaries. The harvest moon was coming in 3 days. According to Thomas, that's when the creature would be strongest. "We need to find its lair," I told Martinez. "Something this smart, it must have a place where it keeps things it's learning from. Maybe that's where the kids are." Just then, one of the rangers burst into the room. "You need to see this," he said, his face pale. "We found something in one of the old mine shafts." He showed us his phone. The photo showed the mine entrance, and scratched into the rock was a message. But this wasn't like the ancient warnings. This was new, written in 3 different handwritings, each matching our missing teens perfectly. The message read, "We are becoming more." My hands felt cold as I stared at the photo. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't just hunting anymore. It was teaching itself, learning, getting better at pretending to be human. And somehow, it was using the teens to do it. "The harvest moon is in 3 days, I said quietly. "That's how long we have to find them." Martinez checked her gun, even though we both knew regular bullets might not help against what we were facing. "Then we better hurry," she said. As if answering her words, a howl echoed through the forest, starting as a wolf's cry but ending in what sounded like human laughter. The next day, the forest felt different. The air was heavy, like right before a storm. We split into 2 teams to search the area around the mine shaft, me and Martinez in one team, 2 rangers in the other. Before we left, I made sure everyone had a radio and knew about the running water rule. "Remember," I said, checking my compass, "if anything feels wrong, head for the creek. Whatever this thing is, it can't follow us across moving water." We'd been walking for about an hour when Martinez grabbed my arm. "Listen," she whispered. At first, I didn't hear anything. Then I caught it humming. Someone was humming Sarah Chen's favorite song. Her parents had told us she was always singing it. The sound came from behind a thick group of trees. We moved closer, staying low and quiet. In a small clearing, we saw someone sitting on a fallen log. It looked like Sarah wearing the same blue jacket she had on when she disappeared. But something was wrong. She was sitting too still, like a statue. "Sarah?" Martinez called softly. "Sarah Chen." The humming stopped. The figure turned its head, turned it all the way around without moving its body. The face was Sarah's, but the eyes were completely black, like empty holes. Martinez reached for her gun, but I stopped her. "Run," I whispered. "Creek's that way. Go." We ran. Behind us, we heard something following, not running, but moving through the trees in a way that wasn't human or animal. The humming started again, but now it sounded like 3 voices singing together, all slightly off-key. We splashed across the creek just as the thing reached the other bank. It looked like Sarah for one more second, then its face seemed to melt, revealing something underneath that I'll never forget. It stood there, watching us with those black eyes, unable to cross the water. "What do you want?" Martinez shouted at it, her voice shaking. The creature tilted its head. When it spoke, it used 3 voices at once, Sarah's, Josh's, and Mike's. "To learn," it said. "To become, to be." Then it turned and vanished into the trees, leaving us standing in the creek, our hearts pounding. Back at base camp, we got worse news. The ranger team had found more evidence, personal items belonging to other missing people, some from cases years old, photos, diaries, homework. The creature had been collecting these things, learning from them. "It's getting ready for something," I said, looking at the calendar. "The harvest moon is tomorrow night." That's when Thomas Blackhawk arrived at our camp, carrying a worn leather bag. "I brought these," he said, pulling out small pouches filled with herbs and marked with tribal symbols. "They won't stop it, but they'll make it harder for the creature to change shape." He helped us set up these pouches around our camp and taught us a few words in his language that might help. "But be careful," he warned. "It's smarter now. It's learned more about being human than ever before." Just before sunset, we heard all 3 teens calling for help again. Their voices came from different directions, each one perfect but somehow wrong. We stayed in our camp, protected by Thomas's pouches and symbols. Then Martinez spotted something that made my blood run cold. Next to our camp, just outside the circle of pouches, someone had written in the dirt. The handwriting changed with each word, switching between Josh's, Sarah's, and Mike's styles. "We know your names now. We know your faces. We know your stories. Tomorrow we become more. Tomorrow we become you." The harvest moon was rising tomorrow night. We had less than 24 hours to find the real teens, if they were still alive. The creature was getting stronger, learning faster, and soon it would be at its most powerful. I looked at Martinez, then at Thomas. They both nodded. We all knew what we had to do. Tomorrow, we would follow it to its lair, even if it meant facing something that could wear our own faces. As night fell, we could hear it out there in the darkness, practicing our names, our voices, learning to sound more and more human. Tomorrow would be our last chance to stop it, and we still didn't know if we could. I checked my gear one last time and tried to rest, knowing that the next night would either save those kids or add us to the creature's collection of faces and memories. The harvest moon was coming, and with it our final chance to face what lived in those woods. The day of the harvest moon started gray and cold. None of us had slept well, jumping at every sound in the darkness. As the sun rose, we got ready for what might be our hardest day yet. "The mine shaft," I said, spreading out our map. "That has to be where it's keeping them. All the tracks lead that way, and it's the only place big enough to hide 3 people. Martinez nodded, checking her gun even though we weren't sure it would help. Thomas gave us each one of his protective pouches to wear around our necks. "Remember," he said, "it has to change every 6 hours. That's when it's weakest. And blood forces it to change." We started hiking toward the mine just as the morning fog was lifting. Everything felt wrong. The forest was too quiet, like all the animals had run away. Even the wind seemed to stop. About halfway there, we found fresh tracks. They looked like someone had been practicing walking. The footprints started animal-like, then became more human, over and over. "It's learning faster now," Thomas whispered. "The harvest moon is making it stronger." We reached the mine entrance around noon. Old boards covered the opening, but some had been recently pulled away. Next to the entrance, someone had written everyone's names over and over. Not just the teens' names, but mine, Martinez's, and even Thomas's. Martinez turned on her flashlight. "Ready?" I nodded, though I didn't feel ready at all. We ducked under the boards and entered the mine. Our flashlight beams showed an old track leading deeper underground. The air smelled musty, with that same strange scent of wet fur and metal. The main tunnels split into smaller ones. We followed the one with the freshest tracks. After about 10 minutes, we heard something that made us all stop voices. But not just any voices. All 3 teens were talking together, their words echoing off the walls. "We understand now. We are becoming. We are learning. We are so many." The voices came from a large cave up ahead. Our flashlights showed mining equipment, old boxes, and then something that made my stomach turn. One whole wall was covered with personal items, photos, clothes, diaries, toys, things taken from people over many years. "Oh my God," Martinez whispered. That's when we saw them. All three teens were there, sitting in a circle. But something was terribly wrong. Their movements weren't quite right, like puppets being pulled by strings. When they turned to look at us, their faces kept shifting. One moment they looked normal, the next moment their features would twist and change. "You came," they said together, their voices mixing in a way that wasn't human. "Now you can help us learn too." They stood up, moving in perfect sync. Behind them, in the shadows, something else moved, something bigger, something that couldn't decide if it was human or animal or both. "Now," I shouted. We all pulled out Thomas's pouches and started saying the tribal words he taught us. The teens, or what looked like the teens, stepped back, their faces twisting in pain. But then the bigger shape in the shadows came forward, and I realized our mistake. We'd been so focused on the teens, we hadn't seen the real threat. The creature emerged, wearing a face that was a mix of all its victims. As the harvest moon rose above ground, its power grew stronger. "Blood!" Thomas yelled. "We need blood!" Martinez understood first. She pulled out her knife and made a small cut on her arm. As soon as the blood hit the air, the creature screamed, a sound that was part human, part animal, and part something else entirely. Its shape began to change, twisting and turning as it fought against the transformation. The teens, the real teens, suddenly collapsed like their strings had been cut. The thing that had been controlling them was too busy fighting its own transformation to hold them anymore. "Get them out," I shouted to Martinez. "Get them to running water." She and Thomas grabbed the teens, who were weak but alive. I stayed behind, facing the creature as it thrashed between forms. Each shape it took was like a nightmare version of someone it had taken before. I backed away slowly, holding up the protective pouch. The creature lunged at me, but its body wasn't working right anymore. It kept changing, hand to paw, face to muzzle, human to animal, and back again. I ran, following the others' flashlight beams. Behind me, the creature's screams echoed through the mine. We carried the teens, running as fast as we could. Finally, we reached the creek. We splashed across just as the creature emerged from the mine. It stood there on the other bank, its body still shifting and changing. In the light of the rising harvest moon, it looked at us with eyes that were sometimes human, sometimes animal, and sometimes something else entirely. "We learn," it said in a voice that was hundreds of voices together. "We become." Then it turned and disappeared into the forest, leaving us standing in the creek, holding three very weak but very alive teenagers. The teens would survive, but they had no memory of their time in the mine. Maybe that was for the best. The official report would say they got lost and were found dehydrated but safe. But I knew the truth, and I knew that somewhere out there it was still learning, still becoming, still waiting for the next harvest moon. As we helped the teens to safety, I couldn't shake one last thing I saw. Just before it disappeared into the forest, the creature had smiled, a smile that looked exactly like mine. A week after we found the teens, I sat in the ranger station, staring at my resignation letter. The official story was simple. 3 kids got lost. We found them. End of story. The Forest Service didn't want to hear about shapeshifters or harvest moons or ancient warnings. Sarah, Josh, and Mike were back with their families. The doctors said they were dehydrated and confused, but otherwise fine. They didn't remember anything about the creature or the mine. When people asked what happened, they just shook their heads and said they got lost. But I knew better. I kept thinking about that wall in the mine shaft, covered with things taken from other victims over the years. The rangers sealed up the mine entrance, but when I went back to check a few days later, the seal was broken. Inside, everything was gone, like something had cleaned out all the evidence. Officer Martinez stopped by my office on my last day. She looked tired, like she hadn't been sleeping well. "You're really leaving?" she asked. I nodded. "There are other places where things like this happen. Other forests, other harvest moons. Maybe next time I can stop it before it takes anyone. She understood. She'd seen what I'd seen. The teens, she said quietly. They're acting a little strange. Nothing big, just little things. The way they move sometimes, or how they all hum the same song without realizing it. I knew what she meant. I'd noticed it too. Sometimes when they thought no one was watching, all three would move in perfect sync, like they were still connected somehow. Maybe part of the creature's influence never quite left them. Thomas Blackhawk had warned me about this. The creature's power leaves marks, he'd said, not just on the outside, but on the inside too. Before I left town, I added one last note to my growing file of similar cases across the country. Every year, usually around the harvest moon, people go missing in forests. Some are never found. Others come back, different. I packed up my office and took one last look at Mount Hood. The forest looked peaceful in the morning light, but I knew better now. Somewhere in those trees, something was waiting, learning, becoming more human with each passing moon. As I drove away, I caught a glimpse of myself in the rearview mirror. For just a second, I thought I saw my smile change into something else, something not quite human. I blinked, and it was gone. But sometimes late at night, I still check my reflection just to make sure it's really me looking back. They say the creature is still out there. Every year, more people go missing. Every year, the stories get stranger. And every harvest moon, if you're in the forest at night, you might hear voices calling, voices that sound almost human, but not quite. I keep tracking these cases, following the pattern across the country. Because I know the truth now, there are things in this world that wear human faces, things that are learning to be like us. And somewhere out there, under the harvest moon, they're getting better at it. The end.